Hi, my darlings. I hope you're having a wonderful day because you are wonderful, and I just always need to remind you of this. I'm your host, Koko, Cornelia Slunsky. Hey, Rocky is saying, like, hey, I'm here too. Well, welcome to another episode of Boujee Best Friend. We have a very educational one today. We're sitting down with the co founder and co CEO of Seed Health, Ara Katz. We talked about the microbiome, more specifically the vaginal microbiome. And ever since I had my ovarian issues and a lot of things going on in that section down there, I just became more and more interested in our bodies, our health, the vagina. And I'm just so happy to chat with her about all things vaginal microbiome, which honestly I didn't even think about before I got diagnosed with endometriosis. And if you are not familiar with Seed, it is a microbiome science company pioneering innovations in living medicine to impact human health. Honestly, impressive. She taught me so much in this episode, and I will definitely have to re-listen a few times to actually soak in all the information. She is so smart. She provided so much value in this conversation. So I hope you have your notebooks out and start writing things down because this is life-changing information. Self-awareness is key. We got to learn about our bodies. We got to learn about ourselves. So without further ado, let's dive into the conversation and welcome Ara to the show. Ara, welcome to Boujee Best Friend podcast.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, I have to say that I'm very honored that you are here because I've been a huge fan of Seed for the longest time, not just from a brain perspective, from all the changes that you've been doing. I have my little packaging right here. So just wanted to thank you for being here. I would love to hear a little bit of your background and how did you start Seed and what made you get interested in the science field at all?
Sure. I'd say my background is very circuitous. Definitely not kind of typical of a founder of a biotech or science company. I obviously have my co-founder Raja Deer, who is the extraordinary scientific mind behind Seed. I met when I was pregnant, and we got to know each other really through that experience. But prior to that, I think my love of an interest in science and health started in high school. When my mom was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, it is when I started reading scientific papers and starting to understand how clinical trials and how clinical research happened and how new innovations made their way into the world in the realm of health. That kind of kicked off a lifelong journey, I think, of wanting to more deeply understand the body and particularly like how we make choices for our health. And also what it really did was also make me really pay attention to the leading edge of science in a number of fields, particularly as it related to, the rise of like well-being and more proactive health. And so I think that was kind of, I was always that nerd that people would text and ask a lot of questions to, not because I would ever like dispense medical advice, but I loved research and I really loved going and finding the answers and connecting dots to scientists and doctors that I thought were really at the forefront of what they were doing related to whatever the question was. And so I also through that time became so surprised by how much we outsource our understanding of our own bodies and how much we like make a lot of decisions without like really deeply understanding anything kind of like underlying about the biology or like how our bodies work. And I think for women, especially, usually you kind of get snapped into learning about your body through either if you get sick or you get pregnant. And so I think when I had a miscarriage, I co-founded previously a mobile commerce company, and was a serial entrepreneur in tech and media. I had a miscarriage, and I think that was really like a big moment for me. That happened actually just before I met my co-founder and got pregnant, right shortly thereafter. But it was really a very pivotal moment in my life where I really went back to, I think, my first love, which is health and biology and science, and really felt that actually it was my time to go back to what I felt was the most impactful. When you're pregnant and you have these kind of pivotal life moments happen, you start to think a lot about what do you want your life to be? What do you want to do with yourself? What do you want to be with your life? And I really knew that I wanted to return to health and really finally build something in this space. And I really wouldn't have done it had I not met my co-founder, because so much of what I knew I wanted to do was make sure that it had really extraordinary science, and I wanted to work with the best scientists in the field. And the microbiome was actually, Raja, my co-founder, and I both found the microbiome in very different ways. He had been tracking the field since 2006. There were some really pivotal mouse studies that had come out about the microbiome, namely that you could take the microbiome of a lean mouse and put it in an obese mouse and vice versa. And the lean mouse would get obese and the obese mouse would get lean. And very similar things happened around also fur and like the luster of fur on a mouse. And, I think a lot of fields of science kind of start to get a lot of attention when people think you can lose weight or look better or look younger. And so the microbiome really, I think, kind of blew up starting in like late 2000s. And then certainly as of 2015 really hit a turning point. And that was when we met. And I had found the microbiome, especially as going through into pregnancy and being somebody who paid attention to a lot of these kind of early stage fields. I really started to attune to, even at the time, although we know a lot more today, how much the microbiome plays like such a key and critical role in the development of a child. And obviously as being pregnant, that was where we started. And that's where our name came from, which was seed, and then seed was kind of born. And we felt like this was the field we were going to work in. And our two very unique skill sets kind of came together to form what is really a biotech company, but with a really beautiful vision to realize the potential of the microbiome.
You said so many things here that I want to tackle. First of them being, when you get sick, that's when you start actually learning about your health. That's when you start learning about, why is this happening to me? And that's what happened to me last year when I had a big ovarian cyst. I was going through surgery. I was diagnosed with endometriosis. Now I'm going through an egg freezing process, which is also becoming very difficult because of all of that. So I'm very excited to actually talk about the vaginal microbiome and just understanding things better, because I can't say that I'm super knowledgeable about it, and I'm sure a lot of people around aren't. So let's just start with the basic question. What exactly is a microbiome and why is it important?
Sure. So, the microbiome is a term that refers to the community of microbes that live in and on us, trillions of microbes, about 76 trillion, and mostly bacteria. Although it does include phages and viruses and fungi, but we focus primarily on bacteria, and that is what majority constitutes. The microbiome, that's kind of the microbiome collectively. Most people, when they speak about the microbiome today, they're really referring to the gut, and that's because the gut, of all the microbiomes of the body, of which there are many, so there's the skin microbiome, there's the nasal microbiome, there's the optical microbiome, there's the oral microbiome, which you're going to start to hear a lot more about. There's of course the vaginal microbiome that we're going to talk about. But the gut really, and the reason that they get used so interchangeably is it's because that's where the field started, but also it's where the most dense ecology and microbiome of the body exists, and the most complex and the most diverse. And so when people refer to the microbiome, technically is all of the microbes that live in and on our bodies, and actually some of their constituent parts and even their genes. That's like the technical meaning. But really, people often use it interchangeably again with the gut. What's really interesting and what we're starting to understand and learn is that the other microbiomes of the body, obviously I'll now transition to like vaginal microbiome, is that it's not that there's more microbes there. It's that environment, that microbiome is literally like going to another planet. It is as different as going to a desert and a rainforest. And so if you think about the gut microbiome, what we know about the gut microbiome, it's incredibly complex. It's very dense, thousands of different strains of bacteria. The vagina and the vaginal microbiome, exactly the opposite. And in fact, in the gut, you want diversity. We don't really know today that there's like one single healthy microbiome, but we do know that diversity is one marker of health in the gut microbiome. In the vagina, you want the opposite. You actually do not want diversity. In fact, you really only want one specific species, lactobacilli, and more than the species, you want a dominance of a very specific strain, which is Lactobacillus crispatus. And vaginal microbiomes break down very reductively kind of into these different types. They're called CSTs. And there's 5 of them, although some science is getting more nuanced. So there's subtypes now, and there's some new classifications. But for the sake of today, we'll just say that there's 5 CSTs. And what we know about these CSTs is that each one kind of has different characteristics. But what we do, what we know about, and by the way, your vaginal microbiome is not fixed. It's not like your genome. So that can fluctuate throughout life, after menstruation, after sex with a new partner, after, based on diet, everything from, stress and, certain contraception, certain cleansers, whether or not you had a past pregnancy, all of these things can impact and disrupt and shift the vaginal microbiome on an ongoing basis. But what we do know is that a CST1, which is a vaginal microbiome that is dominated by Lactobacillus crispatus, is the most stable and resilient and protective vaginal microbiome. And it is least vulnerable to all of the symptoms, conditions that, of course, women suffer from at every stage of life. And it is also correlated with the best reproductive, urogenital, and gynecological outcomes. And so even though we can experience many stressors and disruptions, and we honestly, just by living life, intense exercise, swimming in chlorinated water, sex of all types, including oral sex, fingers, everything, all will impact your vaginal microbiome. So we know that you can't stop living life, but what you want to do is figure out how to create the most stable and protective and defensive vaginal microbiome. That is one that is dominated by L. crispatus, which is the microbe that I was describing.
Okay, which leads me to how can we actually support a healthy vaginal microbiome? Obviously, you mentioned diet is a big thing. Like, what can we do today to just improve?
Yeah,
overall?
so it's very, very interesting. I'll just go back to talking about a little about the gut, because with the gut microbiome, there's many things you can do. Diet, of course, is a huge lever in the gut microbiome. The gut microbiome, because it's so diverse, it's the idea that it doesn't work in quite the same way where you're kind of like missing something and you want to put something back. Well, that's actually a bit of a myth and misnomer around even how probiotics work. But really, there are many factors that relate to the microbiome, both things you can do to nurture it in the gut, like diet, exercise, sleep, hydration, etc., all as well as things that you should avoid. Indiscriminate use of antibiotics, for example, when you don't need them. Or, of course, stress. And there's many factors that are obviously very similar, because stress and anything that really is going to cause inflammation is going to impact you systemically. It doesn't not just your gut. And so when we think about the vaginal microbiome, it's very similar, except that it's very different, because you can't by any other means outside of just introducing those strains of L. crispatus. There's no diet or food or something you could eat to better nurture your vaginal microbiome such that you would then have or find somehow those specific strains. I might be missing them altogether, or you may have had them and then experienced disruptions, and there's no really other way to reintroduce them except for the vaginal symbiotic that we just launched recently, which I'll get to. But however, similar factors to the gut. Of course, like a healthy diet, reducing, things that cause inflammation in the body, being really mindful of when you have sex with a new partner, and just being mindful of the hygiene of sex, as well as, honestly, even just how you wipe.
Okay, yes. Can we talk about wiping? Because I feel like this is such a thing that people don't talk about wiping, but honestly, if you're wiping incorrectly, you can just get so many infections. So please tell us, how do we wipe properly?
Absolutely. There's a few, through I was on a podcast recently, and they were really stuck on the idea of certain sexual acts that somehow introduce fecal microbes into the vagina. You really don't want to be introducing fecal matter near the vagina. That is really how E. coli and other pathogens or microbes that just shouldn't be there get there. It's a very common way. You do not want to be wiping back to front. You just want to be wiping your back separately, back, I guess. And you want to go backwards. And you do not want to bring any microbes from your fecal matter, whether you know it or not, forwards and towards your vagina.
Yeah, I remember how when I was growing up, obviously my mom was teaching me about this, but I never heard that ever in my life at all. So if we do have our vaginal microbiome imbalance, are there any signs, or is it just like unusual itch or odor or discomfort, or what can we look after?
Sure. Yeah, it's really interesting. I think, one of the things that we hear a lot from women most often is that when you have some sort of, and it's very interesting, because obviously depending on whether or not what age you are, whether or not you're in perimenopause, menopause, you're trying to have a baby, or reproductive age, or you're just starting menstruation, you will experience, obviously, at every stage of life, the vaginal microbiome behaves a little bit differently mostly because of the presence or not of different levels of estrogen. But and also menstruation is a huge disruption of the vaginal microbiome because it's actually it's changing the pH, flushing it out and so what's very important is that how your vaginal microbiome actually can rebound. And so when I think a lot of women say to us, the way that they put it is, I just feel off, which of course can mean so many different things. I think it can mean all of the above that you described, which is like itching and dryness or, discomfort. Obviously, if you're getting a UTI most women kind of have that sixth sense and you kind of you can kind of feel it from a mile away, also and then of course discharge and then odor. And odor is very interesting because we have to be so careful because I think women historically, there's a lot of shame and taboo and misunderstanding around odor. But just from a purely scientific perspective, different pathogens and different conditions do produce very specific, what are called VOCs, or called volatile organic compounds, very specific odors. And so odor can be a marker of that something is off, for sure. But it doesn't always mean that, because there is always going to be some sense of an odor. And so I think a lot of marketing, a lot of decades of medical misogyny and pretty misogynistic culture in general have really led women to think that any odor is bad. And so I'm very cautious the way I speak about this. But absolutely, what I will say is that if you know how you normally smell, and then you can understand that sometimes it's off, right? And so I think that odor can be a really important biomarker. As I said, discharge, and particularly the color of discharge. And then, of course, there's other like kind of like burning, itching, sense. But I think there's also just, a lot of women will say to us, I don't have any of those, but I just don't I feel off. Or they'll say, I don't feel anything right now, but I know the minute that I have sex, I'm going to get a UTI. So it's interesting. I think there's also not just the feeling of off, but the anticipation of feeling off.
And then you kind of like become off because you anticipated it.
Yeah, exactly. And then it creates stress, right? It impacts quality of life. And, look, 46 million women in the United States had some sort of vaginal discomfort in the last year. The numbers around BV and many of these unmet medical needs, because there really just hasn't been substantial funding and innovation in these areas. I mean, and antibiotics, there's a lot of antibiotic resistance for E. coli and UTIs. And so a lot of these interventions are simply not working. And then there's also other, of course, new and growing fields like the IVF field, for example. Many women, when they're starting IVF, one of the first things you're doing is taking an antibiotic. And so, of course, you're taking
and that's disrupting your microbiome.
You're literally wiping out not just your gut, but you're also wiping out your vaginal microbiome. And then you're trying to get pregnant.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that there's a lot of ways that understanding the vaginal microbiome is so critical to whatever else, not just when you're sick and when you have a condition, but also if you're trying to get pregnant, if you're trying to recover from pregnancy. The postpartum vaginal microbiome is another area that's really exciting because your vagina changes after in the postpartum period. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity. It also plays a role in dryness, and when there's no estrogen, which ultimately is part of glycogen production, when there's no glycogen, which is the food source that lactobacilli use to be able to do their functions in the vagina, that's very interesting. And of course, many opportunities across perimenopause, menopause, and other areas where estrogen plays a role, or conditions where estrogen plays a role, where there's like huge opportunities also to just like give women better quality of life. You are not necessarily sick or have a condition, but there's areas where the vaginal microbiome, as I said, also with reproduction and fertility, is going to be like such an exciting like next frontier of women's health.
Yeah, so definitely the vaginal microbiome changes during different stages of our life. Is there like puberty, pregnancy, menopause? Is this something that we should like look out for, or what's the best way to support our microbiome?
I mean, I think, it's very much similar to what I was saying earlier, because no matter at any stage, I think you're still looking at a lot of the same disruptions, whether it's like sex or stress or prescriptions or antibiotics or feminine hygiene products, gels, lubricants, condoms and diet
It all
and so
affects it.
and
Yeah.
of course menstruation and even exercise and swimming, and even early research, although this is early, is like even just Brazilian waxing. I read a paper the other day, it can impact your vaginal microbiome, right? Because you're removing one line of defense,
Yeah.
which is pubic hair, right? Which is a part of, has a role in our immune system.
I definitely got infections after going to like a random salon.
Yeah.
Honestly, when it's just like never again. So
Yeah.
that's like not doing that anymore. When it comes to odor, what we were mentioning before, I feel like we were all marketed in a way that like you should smell like flowers down there, or you should smell
Yes.
like, I don't know, rainbows and butterflies, and that's
Yes.
just not the
That's
case.
right.
What are some tips of like every day maintaining like a healthy microbiome? Obviously, what would you suggest for like cleaning or like underwear? Like what is your
So we covered wiping. I mean,
yeah.
I'm a big proponent of, I think also not staying in underwear for, and like any of your sweaty clothes for a really long time.
Or a
And
wet bikini. It's summer right now,
yeah,
so
same goes for bathing suits, right? And like also just swimming in chlorinated water and then sitting in like really hot and warm, moist environments. Like a bathing suit, of course, is a ripe environment for certain microbes, and a lot of women do experience some issues from that. But really, I think one of the most important, and again, just going back to the fact that you're going to live your life and experience disruptions. The reason that the VSO1, which is the vaginal symbiotic that we just launched, which emerges from about 20 years of metagenomic and microbiome research with Dr. Jacques Ravel, who's really like the leading scientist in the field. The reason that it's such an exciting innovation and really the first of its kind is because it's the first vaginal symbiotic to demonstrate that using these very three specific Lactobacillus crispatus strains alongside prebiotics, which are really like the nutrients that those strains need to thrive, is the first symbiotic to be clinically proven to actually, can modulate the vaginal microbiome into a healthy and protective optimal state that is dominated by L. crispatus and persists throughout time as an L. crispatus dominated vaginal microbiome, which means so VSO1 was the reason it's so exciting is because VSO1, which is our vaginal symbiotic, which is 3 proprietary L. crispatus strains, plus the prebiotics that those strains need to thrive, is the first to be clinically studied to effectively shift and create a vaginal microbiome that is the most optimal, protective, and defensive against the imbalances and conditions that we experience every day. And so particularly against and resilient in the face of a lot of the disruptions that we've talked about already today. And so that's very exciting because for the first time, women have a tool that they can actually introduce these correct strains of L. crispatus. These were isolated from over 2,000 samples over many years that Dr. Ravel was able to create this, what's called a strain bank, and then be able to look at their genomes and say, well, if we put these 3 strains together, it will actually be the maximal coverage and the most stable for really any woman starting vaginal microbiome. And that's very important because a lot of women will say, well, do I need to know what type of vaginal microbiome I have for this to work? And the answer is no. And that's what we were able to show in our clinical trial, which is no matter what vaginal microbiome you were starting, 90% of the women in our clinical trial converted to an L. crispatus dominant vaginal microbiome that was stable, and it maintained all regulated pH for the duration of the use, and which is very, very important as well. And we were able to show that it colonized and it engrafted and it persisted even through menstruation, which is very important because, as I said, menstruation can usually be a big disruptor.
Yeah. So how you said that the research was it 20 years that you were preparing for this?
So Dr. Jacques Ravel was he got the first grant ever to study vaginal microbiome from the NIH. His research has been funded by Gates and NIH over the last almost 20 years. We are his partner in developing and translating that breakthrough work. We've been working for 5 years with him to translate his work into really life-changing, innovations like VSO1.
So this is a suppository, right? You put it in.
It is.
Tell us about that. I feel like some women might be like even thinking, oh, well, just maybe it's a bit scary to do it in that way.
Sure. So there's a lot of myth busting that's like and misnomers that exist around understanding vaginal probiotics. I think there's no shortage of marketing to the effect of taking an oral capsule. We actually tested in our clinical trial against the leading oral vaginal probiotic as well as against ourselves in a capsule taken orally, and we were unable to show any efficacy. And that's for a number of reasons. One is that if you think anatomically, there's really no way for those strains to make their way to the vagina through the GI tract. Number two is that you really need the exposure. You need the microbes to be exposed to the vaginal epithelium to be able to adhere and colonize to actually modulate the vaginal microbiome. And we were able to demonstrate that. And there's a lot of research and papers, even in the scientific community, that talk about the lack of efficacy with a vaginal probiotic.
So what are some of other common myths or just like some misconceptions that people have either about microbiomes or about vaginal
Sure.
microbiomes?
I think a lot of women who are desperate are using, you know, and very understandably are using compounds like boric acid, for example.
Yeah, I've heard of that. I don't even know why that's like becoming such a quote
Well,
unquote
it's because
known
if
remedy.
if you're really desperate, it's going to kill everything.
Yeah,
The problem
literally
is
everything.
it's like clearing a garden and then being curious why the weeds grow back.
Yeah.
So if you're clearing everything, you need to then reintroduce the seeds of what you actually want to be growing there. They're not going to magically appear. And so, and as I said, it's not like the gut where, you know, through the consumption of certain foods, you might be able to introduce certain microbes, you might be able to enrich or grow certain microbes. But if they're not there in the vagina, they're not coming from anywhere. So you need to actually introduce it. So boric acid or an antibiotic, for example, especially if you really need one, I mean, antibiotics, I'm anti overuse of antibiotics, but I'm not anti-antibiotics because, of course, in the right moments, they're incredibly important and critical and amazing innovation. But the problem is that one, you can take an antibiotic, but you're scorching earth, but then not replanting anything. So a lot, you know, that is partially why it's so important. That's why we created VSO1, because we know that a lot of women do get into these acute situations where they have to take something extreme, but then what you need to do is you need to reintroduce L-crispus, and that's obviously a big part of what VSO1, one of the use cases that VSO1 is for.
So do you suggest taking VSO1 every day or maybe just like when you're feeling off?
No. The way that, no, you don't need to. So the way that it's designed, very similar to like a cleanse or a kind of a detox, is that the first month is the most intense. So the first month is called VSO1 reset. It's 6 tablets. You start it right after you're menstruating, or if you don't menstruate regularly, you can start it at any time. And you take it day 1, 4, 7, 14, 21, 28. So it's like 6 tablets. Take it every few days for the first month. That's the big investment up front. That's the planting of your garden, so to speak.
I like that analogy.
Yes. Every month after that, it's just 2 tablets a month, day 1 and 14, and that's it.
Okay.
Yep.
That's much easier than just, I mean, because some people are like, oh, I forgot to take one. I didn't. Yeah.
Exactly.
So this is like a schedule.
But you are right. It is a suppository. So a lot of women, but it has an applicator. So American women are not as comfortable as European women.
I'm European.
It just inserting things. So we of course have an applicator, and it's very, very easy and very simple to use. And you don't really feel anything. The most that we hear about is that there's sometimes as the tablet is dissolving, it's a very specific technology that we had to design called the Smart Tab, which allows the tablet to dissolve slowly so that you get the most amount of exposure to the epithelial so that the microbes can take hold. They have a place to live and a nutrient source. And so sometimes you get a little bit of residue, you know, like in your underwear or whatever.
Like
it's
a
not
little discharge, but
okay. It's not discharge. It's just residue from the tablet. Yeah, that's the most. I mean, some women, I when I use it, I don't experience that, but some women do. But I mean, in exchange for peace of mind and a lot of the benefits, I think a lot of women say given how many women do so many other things, that seems like the easiest side effect to deal with.
Definitely. It's so funny that you mentioned European and US when I'm born and raised in Croatia, European. So in Croatia, it's very normal to just like when you have an issue to put a tablet in there. Like when I was growing up, when I would have when I was like getting my first period, it was just a normal thing to just put something in and it cures it actually. But you mentioned that you're not antibiotics, but when they're like used correctly, but what do we do? Let's say we do have to take an antibiotic. How do we kind of how do we get our body back into that normal function, let's say? Yeah,
so it's a great question to ask me right now, because about 5 weeks ago, we presented data at DDW, which is in our world of gut microbiome, probably like the most preeminent like gastroenterological conference. And we just published the same data in the Journal of Gastroenterology, really as the first probiotic to be able to demonstrate the rescue effect of DSO1, which is our gut microbiome probiotic, the jar that you were showing. We're the first probiotic to be able to demonstrate the rescue effect while taken alongside and after broad spectrum antibiotics, as well as the preservation of gut barrier integrity, as well as the enrichment of diversity and gut function during and after antibiotic use. And so we're very, very proud of that work, because there's a lot of misunderstanding about whether you take a probiotic with antibiotics. Do you take it after? When do you take it? Do you take it different times a day? And so I think we're really excited about that study, and really I think the clinical community and medical doctors have responded super well, because they are always telling people to take an antibiotic with a probiotic, but they don't really have a lot of guidance as to which one. So we're really excited about that.
And any other medication, I'm sure they're not really good for our microbiome.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and I just to say that, like, I just mentioned the gut, but obviously antibiotics, for example, as I was saying earlier, also impact the vagina. And so you're very similarly to why you take one for, take Cipro for a UTI, you're also able to wipe out everything there. And so our guidance would be to use both DSO1 and VSO1 if you need to take an antibiotic. As it relates to other medications, I think a lot of people don't really know that, like, NSAIDs, which are non-steroidal, anti-inflammatories, like Advil, for example, ibuprofen, those all impact our microbiome. I mean, many antacids as well, even hormonal contraception is going to impact the vaginal microbiome. So I would say that, like, when you start understanding the microbiome, I always say it's kind of like seeing the Matrix. Once you kind of see it, you kind of can't stop thinking about how actually a lot of the things we do every day impact this physiologies of our body, and then of course have major impacts in our systemic health. And some of those choices can be very nurturing and important and helpful to helping our microbiomes function so that they can do their job to help us function. In some cases, they can be really disruptive, and of course then have a domino effect, or of course systemic health implications for us, because we're hurting both our microbiome, but then of course then it can't carry out the critical functions that it does in our body that keep us really healthy. And of course that very related to, like, inflammation, our immune systems, where particularly the gut microbiome, so much of our immune system really resides in the gut, and it is a bit of a control center for so many other organ systems and biological functions.
What about when we're on our period, like tampons and pads? How does does that disrupt the vaginal microbiome, or, like, what would you suggest?
It's a great question. I mean, they're I would say inconclusive today. I think that it really depends which ones we're talking about. I mean, there's PFAS in some of them. There's some pads are coated with different materials. I think a lot of it depends if you're talking about organic cotton versus regular cotton. Ironically, like, organic cotton probably would have a higher likelihood of microbes growing than something that was treated, right? And so there's a bit of a catch-22 when you start thinking about it microbiologically. But I think for the most part, I think I think that assuming, and I think again, of course, other implications to using tampons, and there's all the recent studies that just came out with lead, and certainly that's some of these things are not just impacting your vaginal microbiome, but also your human part of you, of course, as well. But for the most part, I think some of that really comes down to which products you're using and what are the chemicals or preservatives or other compounds that are used to make them, which of course will absolutely impact your vaginal microbiome. I think the impact, especially if you have a fairly healthy and resilient and stable vaginal microbiome, is probably fairly low, assuming that you're using fairly good products that are well safety tested. I think one of the things that's not, though, tested in a lot of products that go in our vaginas is things like osmolality and what's crossing these barriers. And that was a big part of the safety work that we did with VSO1, and really created some of these new biomarkers to look at. Because of course, what we get asked to look, what we get asked to test to market something is different than what we should test. And the more we understand about science, it opens up the opportunity to test new things, because we start to understand that other things impact our health, like vaginal microbiome. And so our product is the first to be tested in tissue models that really look at microbiome impact as well as epithelial impact as well.
This is not a vaginal microbiome question, but I guess our gut microbiome.
Mm-hmm.
Alcohol and drugs and like that kind of lifestyle,
Yeah.
what does that do? I mean, having a glass of wine here and there, I'm sure it's not like that detrimental, but is it?
We published a paper on alcohol and the gut microbiome and actually DSO1 in alcohol, which had like a rescue effect in the body. We studied the alcohol that was used in the study was a shot of Grey Goose vodka. And just with one shot of Grey Goose vodka, you could induce permeability in the gut. And so the answer is alcohol is actually, I mean, it's a very powerful, as you know, antimicrobial, but it also has a huge impact in disrupting the barrier, the epithelial barrier, and creating permeability in addition to, of course, the other antimicrobial properties that it has. So it is not the best news, but it's probably not shocking news that it's not good for your microbiome.
Definitely. Yeah.
I don't think, I don't think that I should discourage anyone from a glass of wine once in a while. Sure. And if it's red wine, if there's polyphenols and other compounds that are actually probably good for your microbiome. But, we do know, and we did publish a paper and there's lots of research that demonstrates the impact of alcohol in the gut microbiome.
This is also fascinating for me. I feel like after this conversation, I'm just going to dive deep and like try to learn everything about this. I just have a few more questions before we wrap up. I saw somewhere that you describe yourself as 50% human, 100% super organism. Tell me about that. I just love that. I feel like we don't even see ourselves as living organ. We just like kind of don't even have the awareness of that we are actual beings,
That's right. Yeah, I think I didn't just describe myself, but it's all people.
Yeah.
Although on the days when I'm managing a startup and 2 children and doing things fairly well, sometimes I guess I think I am a superorganism, but really everybody is, every living human. The term superorganism, or another scientific word for it is holobiont, is the idea that we are kind of a multitude of ecologies, and like kind of if you think about it, we're actually, our bodies are really no different than a coral reef or a rainforest. We are that many species. So about 50% of our cells are not human in our body, they're microbial. And of course, like that, it's very interesting because microbes express probably, there's different counts and different scientific papers kind of give different numbers, but you could say that microbes express almost 100 times the genes than our human cells. Now, some of those genes are not as important and impactful, but so it's not 1-to-1, but just to give you some numbers, I mean, the idea that if you can think about for all of understanding history of medicine, everything what we think about today was really derived for only seeing half the picture. And so it's really a beautiful opportunity to really see ourselves not just as whole organisms that are not just human, but also are these like co-evolved beings that, through thousands and thousands of years play these like roles within our body, like that we are host to these microbes. Some scientists say they are host to us, depending on who you're talking to. But what's really exciting is, of course, that the more we understand this complex, very invisible to the human eye universe that lives within us, it opens up extraordinary opportunities for living in this world that we've created for ourselves that really was not built for our biology. And I think that, it is also a beautiful idea to think about us walking around with these little coral reefs. It also is very important because it centers us in the environment and in our greater ecologies as well, which, one little scoop of soil in your hand has more microbes in it than stars in the Milky Way galaxy.
Wow.
So, you start to create a very existential and beautiful way of seeing also how we're very connected to that, handful of soil, and of course to other animals and other organisms. And we could go on and on about the microbiomes, even the vaginal microbiomes of other species, which is really, all the like koala bears that have chlamydia. There's like a whole other episode.
Koalas and chlamydia.
Yeah, but it's really interesting because what you're seeing out in the environment, there's been a lot of research even on like the gut microbiome of seagulls and how plastics in the ocean are disrupting the seagull gut microbiome. And so these microbes play such a critical and important role not just in our own bodies, but of course in the environment. And it's a beautiful field of study because it not just, to your point, like reveals, new solutions and treatments like we were talking about with VSO1, but it really reveals, like, I think what you were getting at is a whole new way to see ourselves. And I think that's partially, of course, what I get to wake up and do every day is help people see themselves differently. And then most excitingly, make choices that can really nurture this kind of other half of ourselves to take care of our whole self, which is, of course, very, very exciting and a really necessary and new framework for how we think about caring for ourselves, because the ways we've been doing it, of course, are not working.
I have two more questions. Obviously, I can talk to you for hours because this is just also fascinating. Running you said you're running a startup. I see it as huge. Like you're such an inspiration. Like for like any young entrepreneurs, aspiring entrepreneurs, what piece of advice you can say? Like what should they be ready for?
Well, I say start. I think I say start. I said it's not a fast answer, but I say startup. I think it's a bit. No matter how many people, no matter how many employees you have, I think that's a mindset, and I think that means that you have to, no matter what, stay on the edge of what you're doing and stay and live in the future, and most importantly, create the future. And so that I just say startup because it's a mindset. But yes, we are kind of beyond being a startup.
Yeah.
Kind of a reality I can't accept. But yes, we are very much a startup. But we work and act and behave like one, which I think is very important. In terms of advice, I think I it was interesting. My mom, before my mom died, she gave me this wooden pin that is mounted on this little wooden block and lives on the wall in my room. And it said she didn't always follow the recipe. And I think that I've always loved that for a number of reasons. But for the most part, I think it's like a really pretty important reminder that there really is no one way. And I think that like people will be like, oh, you have to do this with investors. You have to do this. You have to do this. I'm like, it's not really interesting to do what everybody else does. Mm-hmm. And I think that for every example, someone who says this has to be this, or people who tell are instructing, particularly young entrepreneurs about like how to do things. I think there's so much to learn from that, but I think that you have to take that in and then you have to make it your own. And there really is, and we're in such a beautiful. I mean, I know it's a scary moment and there's a lot of uncertainty in our world, but it's also a pretty extraordinary moment in terms of what we have access to and what we can create. And I think that it's boring to do what everybody else does. And I also think that there's no rules and nobody got up and did anything extraordinary and said, oh yeah, I just did it the way this person did. And therefore we had a good outcome. I mean, that's just not how we move the world forward. And so I think that, she didn't always follow the recipe to me is like the mantra that I think any young entrepreneurs should carry. And I think especially for women who are fed a lot of different ideas about what female founders and starting things should look and sound and feel like. And I think you do it your way.
This is such a simple sentence. Don't always follow the recipe, but it's just changed. Mind blown. It really is mind blown because you always think you have to do it in a certain way. One final question that I ask all of my guests is, what piece of advice would you give to your younger self? Even though this is a great advice, the recipe one, but if you're thinking of the younger version of you.
It's a beautiful question. I'm like, where do I start?
What age did it occur in your mind as when I asked that question?
Oh, probably high school. Do not just listen to your gut, act on it.
I love that. This was such a beautiful conversation. Thank you again for being here. I know that we have a little 20%, 25% discount for all of our Boujee Bestie listeners. So I'm going to put it in the show notes, but also it is 25 Boujee BF for first month of any seed products. Ara, please tell everybody where they can find you. Where can they find seed? Where they can find your Instagram, anything? How can they get in touch?
Sure, it's very easy. Seed.com, seed.com. And at Seed on Instagram.
I love it. I love the branding overall. Honestly, it's stunning. I'm just so impressed with everything you guys are doing, and I hope everybody learned something today. I will definitely be listening to this episode multiple times to relearn everything. But thanks again for being here.
Anybody has any questions, we have a whole psych care team. They're called Psych Care because they're our scientific care team, and they love answering all science, health, product related questions. And they're
we need
extraordinary at it. And we get beautiful feedback from people all the time because of the depths of the way we answer questions. And so if anyone has any, please send them to us.
So they go to seed.com and there's like going to be a section where they can ask questions?
You can find Psych Care. You can also just DM us on Instagram, which is like a really easy way to do it as well. Or you can just email psycare@seed.com, which is SCI care, CARE at seed.com.
Amazing. Well, I'll write everything in the show notes so you guys can easily access it. Thank you. This was wonderful. I hope everybody has a beautiful day, and I'll see you guys next week. Bye. Boujee Bestie, thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode. Be sure to subscribe to my podcast so you never miss out. I release new episodes every Friday. If you love Boujee Best Friend, please leave a 5-star rating and a review. Your support means the world and it helps the show grow. You can also follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube at Koko Beauty, and you can find Boujee Best Friend on Apple, Spotify, and all other major podcasting platforms. Love you. Bye.